So the central principle of the old way we were governed, the idea of the sovereignty of Parliament, isn't just as people like Dominic Grieve and whatever and John Bercow thought, a lot of people sitting in the Commons chamber having the right to tell all the rest of us what to do. Parliament is sovereign because it embodies, in the broadest sense of the word, the popular consent of the nation. That's what the idea of king, lords and commons. Everybody is represented there, either in person or by their representative. However, there is a contrary idea. Many of you will remember that moment very recently when J.D. Vance went to Munich and lectured Europe on what had gone wrong in Europe. And what the point that he was essentially making, we can now spell it out quite clearly, Europe had a different meaning, or gave a different meaning, to the idea of democracy. Democracy simply means, or should mean, the rule of the majority. In Europe, that has become a dirty term, especially in Germany, because of course the majority were seen as having created Nazism. And that means the post-war constitutions are all designed to bridle the majority, to tie them down with legislative, with legal, with bureaucratic ties, which is why you see the extraordinary business of political parties that enjoy enormous electoral mandates being ruled illegal or challenged. And what Blair tried to do, indeed I would argue succeeded in doing in Britain, was exactly that. Blair, you will remember, we all laughed at it. A new country, yeah, well, cool Britannia, how silly, 800, 900 years old. We're a cool new country. But you know what? We were. And what we need to do, we need to understand what Blair actually did. He takes this idea that power shouldn't essentially reside with the people because the people can't be trusted. Remember, you look at George Orwell's brilliant analysis. The left, bizarrely, has always treated the people with contempt. That wonderful phrase, the lumpen proletariat, the fools, the unsophisticates, those who are not refined, have proper political antennae like us. And so what you do is, and it was spelled out absolutely clearly in 2003 in a speech by Charlie Falconer, who is the first Lord Chancellor of the new dispensation, in which he says, it is clear that although we've had this tradition of power deriving from Parliament, there are many areas, if not most, where it is inappropriate, that we want new machinery. And they create that new machinery. And it's of two types. The first is you create the machinery of the quasi-autonomous non-governmental organization, the expert committee. The most important of them being the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, which sets interest rates and essentially determines that whole complex area of fiscal policy and economic management, as we can now see with catastrophic consequences. The mishandling of sterling since 1997 is utterly tragic, particularly the sale of government debt. We are the country that has sold most government debt indexed linked at exactly the moment when interest rates were zero. In other words, there was bound to be inflation. The stupidity is mind-blowing. Again, another one of these quangos is English nature. This is the thing that determines that a handful of bats are so important that we spent £100 million protecting them when we're trying to construct HS2. Or the comfortable temperature of fish is so important that I think we spend 300 million in our currently half-constructed nuclear power station trying to insulate them against getting a little bit overheated from the circulating. And madness, complete madness. Or the Climate Change Committee. It's absolutely marvellous. If you knew John Selwyn Govern, you make a fortune out of the thing. Otherwise, you were left with power prices which are 4 times those of America. Do you know how many of these committees there are? 444. Labour claimed to have closed 6 of them, which gives us 338. They control 1/3 of state expenditure. That's between 500 and 600 billion pounds a year. You do not control a penny of it. You cannot appoint or unappoint or dismiss a single member. It is a completely astonishing. And there's also a very interesting example of why it's such a dreadful thing. You may not realise it. You actually stress tested the idea of government by a single expert committee. And of course, when you put it like that, experts know, don't they? And by the way, those of you who are interested in political theory, I get a sense that some of you are, you'll be familiar that of the 2 great Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, one of them, Plato, espouses the theory of the rule by the expert. Aristotle, I'm a terrible Aristotelian, Aristotle has a brilliantly opposite idea, and it's appropriate that I was fed beforehand, because Aristotle says the judge of a meal is not the cook, it's the eater. It's you. It's not the, it's brilliant, it's completely brilliant. He's wonderful. Anyway, we were ruled, ladies and gentlemen, during COVID, by a single issue committee. We were ruled by SAGE. I mean, the name SAGE, you know, these are great solemn philosophical figures draped in toga with laurel wreaths on their head, absolutely, hands clean, purely concerned with the public welfare. But there is a little problem, isn't there? They had one objective. Nobody should die of COVID. To do that, you close down the entire NHS and turn it into a national COVID service. So it didn't matter. Indeed, it was positively welcome if you died of a heart attack or cancer or pretty well much anything else. Moreover, because it was so important, nobody died of COVID. And by the way, people here are quite good at statistics, I think. Does anybody remember what the average age of death from COVID was? 82. What is the average age of death? 81. Get COVID, live longer. I wanted that to be the slogan, It never took off. It's terribly sad. But anyway, and we could then continued to make sure nobody died of what was really, in figures, much less than a bad flu year, if you actually look at the deaths for that year. We decided that we were going to close down everything, including schools. So 3 generations of school children who were at absolutely no risk whatever lost their education. Further, in order to close everything down, we had to borrow money on a scale which would have financed a middling war. For absolutely no purpose. And having done that and given people money for doing bugger all, are we really surprised that the notion that you actually have to work has half died? That there's been this vast rocketing in people assuming that welfare is simply a lifestyle choice. We can see, in other words, what you can see is the worst possible way of ruling anything is by a single issue committee. Government is about weighing things. It's extraordinary that there've now been discussions of this at very, very high levels. Even people sitting on the committee saying, no economists talked to us. Nobody explained to them what the consequences of lockdown were going to be, like how many 100 million, do you realise, it really should have been very simple, roughly, do you realise for every day you lock down, we are going to borrow 20 billion pounds? Nobody bothered to do it. So you create this extraordinary structure of expert government. Then you do the other thing, which I think is even more damaging. You utterly subvert our system of law. And where to begin? Well, one very obvious point, because it sounds so good. Because again, you see, in the same way that government by experts sounds good, don't human rights sound lovely? Who could possibly object to human rights? I always say they're Paddington Bear. You can see it with the sweet little sort of squishy red pork pie hat on, little luggage label. Oh, isn't it sweet with Peru? Because obviously, you know, you've got to list Peru written around there. Little battered leather suitcase, and everybody goes. Ladies and gentlemen, the idea of human rights is destructive of human society. Think about it. If there are universal or European human rights, it means you as a participant in a national legislature have got no means of making them or regulating them because they exist over and above you. It means as a universal human being who is completely independent of history, tradition, custom, nationality, everything else. It means there shouldn't be nations. It means that the newly landed, you know, Eritrean or Ethiopian or Afghan, you know, although he's going to do a little bit of raping and pillaging, no doubt will settle down and shake down and be completely like us, you know, minus 2 or 3 young girls and whatever, and just a neighbour like any one of us. Ha ha. It's a lie. And it's a lie which is completely destructive of any sensible view of human society. But the thing that's really shocking is what the lawyers did with it, particularly the man who invents this stuff, a man called Tom Bingham. And by the way, Tom Bingham's obituary in the Guardian, one of the longest ever published in the Guardian, was written by a man called Philippe Sands, who you may remember was counsel for Mauritius in the dispute over the Chagos Islands, and the Bingham lecture at Cambridge last year was given by Richard Hermer, the Attorney General who authorises the procedure of the Chagos Islands. And let me just give you 2 quick insights into Bingham's views on human rights. The first is, he says it in Australia rather than here, which is probably quite wise. He says the following: human rights are anti-democratic, counter-majoritarian, and are designed to protect the minority at the expense of the majority. And he lists the minorities beginning with the mentally sick, like Kalakane and Rudakabana. Can you imagine? In other words, when you read about two-tier justice, it's actually written into the system. It's not the result of a silly judge. It is actually written into the concept of the system. If you despair about the Chagos Islands, again, what does Bingham do? And this is, remember, all done with no input from you at all. None of this is ever discussed. None of this is ever legislated on. None of this is ever debated in Parliament. None of it ever appears in a manifesto. It's done purely on the basis of legal authority. Bingham produces his extraordinary book on the so-called rule of law. Now, the rule of law is obviously essential to how government operates. It means proper procedure. Now, that's what it means, right? But Bingham completely alters it. You may remember that God managed to create the world in 7 days. That was not enough for Bingham. He requires 8 points of the rule of law. 5 of them are completely unexceptional. 3 of them are totally extraordinary. The first is that he reinterprets the idea of equality before the law, the fundamental principle. And he says, and it's completely nonsense logic, it's Alice in Wonderland logic. He says, therefore, the same laws apply to everybody. In other words, the newly landed asylum seeker is entitled to every protection that you and I are. Deranged. No other country does that. The second thing is, he says, irrespective of whether the European Convention had been incorporated into English law, human rights are a fundamental part of common law. And then he goes on and says, so is international law, hence the Chagos Islands. In other words, on the authority of one man, we stood common law on its head. So that's the mess that we're in now. And ladies and gentlemen, what makes this mess irretrievable and accounts for our present plight is that in 2010, Cameron behaved even more stupidly than Churchill in 1951. He proclaimed himself the heir of Blair, and he entrenched every one of the things that I have described. That's what happened. It is a Conservative government that introduces non-crime hate incidents. These things that are being used to strangle freedom of speech. It is Theresa May who legislates net zero for 2050, which is why it's judges who determine whether you can drill in the North Sea. I mean, if Miliband tries to say you can, immediately there will be another legal challenge. And so long as I think it's the 2015 Act, remains on the statute book, the judges will find against them. It was judges who ruled against fracking. This is lunatic. Similarly, the Equality Act means that judges determine wages. Do we all realise the reason that Birmingham is bankrupt is the Equality Act, which legislates can you believe it, legislates the Marxist labour theory of value. In other words, judges determine wages against men and women. It's completely deranged. It's complete. And the whole business of transgender is because the equality, why transgender? Well, again, let's be quite clear. Who is it who begins the process of self-recognition for transsexuals? Maria Miller under Theresa May. It's under the Conservatives. But the thing that makes it so deadly is that the Equality Act of 2010, on the one hand, makes sex a protected characteristic and gender. So, of course, you get the war of two sets of rights against each other. This is the mess. This is what we did to compound that mess. And, unfortunately, crowned by Theresa May, actually calling us the nasty party. Ladies and gentlemen, you need a nasty party. The confounding vice of the English is being nice. That's when you throw welfare at people who don't deserve it. You need a nasty party. You need a realistic party. And we threw all that away. So, ladies and gentlemen, to put it very quickly, before we tear what I've said apart, which is up to you, we have got, if the Conservative Party is to escape at all from its present bind, we've got to admit what we did, apologise for it, explain it, and go back to that proper Disraelian position. Recognise there are thousands of things that need to be done, but there has to be, in exactly the same way Thatcher did, you've got to prioritise policy. The reason woke is so powerful in Britain is that it's entrenched in that legal structure that I've described. It's also, of course, that structure of the quangos, of the trade unions, of the universities, of the civil service, of all the arts bodies. All of them are knitted together, but it's supported by law. And the only way you will break it is not, with all the eloquence of Douglas Murray or whatever. The eloquence will do nothing to break it until the legal structure is undone. We'll get nowhere. So the great repeal, the undoing of all of this, and the restoration of 1997 has to be the foundation of what I would call a broad front of the right. Thank you.